September 1944. The Allied armies are racing across France toward Germany. Thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of men, pushing east with unstoppable momentum. The Germans are retreating, but they're not broken. They're watching, waiting for an opportunity to counterattack, to find a weak point in the Allied lines. And they think they've found one. German reconnaissance has spotted what appears to be an entire American armored division gathering near the Luxembourg border. Hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, supply trucks, radio intercepts confirm it. The volume of communications matches a full division preparing for a major offensive. Aerial photographs show the unmistakable signatures of a massive military force. There's just one problem with this intelligence. Almost none of it is real. That's not a division. It's 23 inflatable tanks, some plywood artillery pieces, and about 1,100 men with paintbrushes, sound equipment, and the guts to pretend they're 10 times their actual size. They're the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, and they're running the most elaborate military deception operation in American history. The Germans don't know it yet, but they're about to waste weeks of planning and thousands of troops fighting an army that doesn't exist. An army made of rubber and canvas. An army of ghosts. This is the story of how artists, designers, and sound engineers went to war with fake equipment and real courage. How they saved thousands of lives by drawing enemy fire to themselves, and how their contribution remained classified for nearly 50 years after the war ended. But to understand why the Ghost Army existed at all, you need to understand how desperate the deception problem had become by 1944. Modern war is about information. You need to know where the enemy is, what they're planning, where their forces are concentrated. And just as importantly, you need to make sure the enemy doesn't know the same things about you. Every army in World War II spent enormous resources on camouflage, on hiding their real positions and intentions. But the Allies realized something more ambitious was possible. Instead of just hiding your forces, what if you could create fake forces? What if you could make the enemy see entire divisions where none existed? Make them waste ammunition, bombing empty fields? Make them position their troops to counter threats that weren't real? The British had been doing this kind of deception in North Africa with some success. Dummy tanks made of wood and canvas fooled German aerial reconnaissance. The Germans themselves had used dummy installations to draw Allied bombing raids away from real targets. But the Americans wanted to take it further. They wanted mobile, believable, coordinated deception units that could move with the advancing army and create phantom forces wherever they were needed. The idea was brilliant, but the execution required something unusual: artists. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was activated in 1944, and its roster reads like a who's who of the American art world. Fashion designers, painters, sound engineers, actors, set designers from Broadway. These weren't typical soldiers. They were creative professionals who'd been recruited specifically because they knew how to create convincing illusions. Bill Blass, who'd become one of America's most famous fashion designers after the war, was there. So was Ellsworth Kelly, who'd become a renowned abstract painter. Art Kane, the photographer. Dozens of others who'd go on to significant careers in the arts. But in 1944, they were enlisted men learning how to make a Sherman tank out of rubber and air. The equipment they used was genuinely ingenious. The inflatable tanks were made of rubberized canvas stretched over an internal frame. With an air pump, you could inflate a full-size Sherman tank in about 15 minutes. From 100 feet away, it looked real. From the air, through the grainy black and white aerial photography the Germans used, it looked completely convincing. The details mattered. Real tanks leave track marks in mud, so the Ghost Army would drag logs behind vehicles to create realistic-looking tracks leading to and from the dummy tanks. Real tank units have maintenance areas, latrines, command posts, so the Ghost Army set up fake installations with appropriate props and activity. Real Army units make noise. Tank engines, vehicle movement, radio chatter. The Ghost Army's sonic deception unit recorded actual sounds from real armored divisions, tanks starting up, trucks moving, soldiers shouting orders. Then they played these recordings through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks, creating the audio signature of a division on the move. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated part. The Ghost Army had radio operators who mimicked the communications patterns of real units. Every military unit has a distinctive radio, fingerprint, patterns in how often they transmit, what kind of messages they send, what frequencies they use. The Ghost Army studied these patterns and replicated them perfectly, creating a convincing electronic signature. But the most dangerous part of the deception was the personal element. For the illusion to work, the Ghost Army soldiers had to act like they were part of the units they were impersonating. They wore patches from divisions that were actually fighting miles away. They went into local towns and bars, talking loudly about their division's plans, letting information accidentally slip to civilians who might be enemy informants. This was incredibly risky. If the Germans figured out what was happening, if they realized this was a deception unit, the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army would be sitting targets. They had minimal real firepower, no armor, no artillery. Their only defense was the illusion itself. The first major operation came in September 1944, near Brest in Brittany. The real American forces needed to move south, but they couldn't leave the area undefended without alerting the Germans to their departure. So the Ghost Army moved in. Over 3 days, they set up a phantom division, inflatable tanks deployed in realistic formations, speakers playing recorded tank sounds, radio operators maintaining the communications pattern of the departed units. Local civilians saw American soldiers with the right patches, heard the right accents, watched tanks moving in the distance. The Germans never realized the real units had left. Their reconnaissance reported a full division still in position. When they finally attacked, expecting to hit a major American force, they found a few hundred artillerymen and engineers, and a bunch of deflated rubber tanks. By then, the real American units were 50 miles south, hitting German positions that had been left undermanned because troops had been held back to counter the Phantom Division. The operation was a complete success, and it established the pattern the Ghost Army would follow for the next 7 months. They ran over 20 major operations, from France to the Rhine, each one a carefully choreographed performance, where the penalty for a bad review was death. They impersonated the 2nd Armored Division, the 6th Armored Division, making German intelligence believe American forces were in places they weren't, preparing for attacks that would never come. The numbers are staggering. At its peak effectiveness, the 1,100 men of the Ghost Army convinced German intelligence they were a force of 30,000. Every German soldier diverted to counter a phantom threat was a soldier who couldn't fight against the real American advance. Every German artillery shell wasted on an empty field was a shell that didn't kill an American soldier. But living this lie was psychologically brutal. These men knew they were targets. They knew that if their deception failed, they'd be overrun with almost no ability to defend themselves. They set up fake headquarters within German artillery range. They drove around in vehicles marked with unit insignia that made them priority targets. And they did it with equipment that couldn't fight back. One of the Ghost Army's artists, Harold Lehner, later described the experience. "We were the bait in a trap. We knew we were bait. But we also knew that every day the Germans wasted trying to figure out where this Phantom Division was going to attack was a day when real soldiers weren't dying." The attention to detail was obsessive because it had to be. If a single inflatable tank wasn't positioned correctly, if the mud around it didn't look right, if there weren't the appropriate amount of soldiers moving around it, German aerial reconnaissance might spot the deception. The artists in the Ghost Army understood that their canvas was the battlefield itself, and the audience was trying to kill them. They even created fake shoulder patches for their own unit, designing insignia that looked official but didn't correspond to any real division. When they went into towns, they'd wear patches from the units they were impersonating. But among themselves, they wore their Ghost Army patch, a visual reminder of their unique and dangerous mission. The sonic deception operations were particularly harrowing. The half-tracks, with the massive speakers, had to get close to German lines to be effective, sometimes within a mile or two. The speakers would blast recordings of tank columns, creating the impression of a major force moving into position. But those half-tracks were lightly armored, slow, and carrying equipment that made them easy to spot. On several occasions, German artillery opened fire on the sonic units, having pinpointed their location by the sound. The crew's only option was to shut down the speakers, which ended the illusion, or keep playing and hope they could finish the mission before they were hit. More often than not, they kept playing. The Ghost Army's most successful operation came during the Rhine crossing in March 1945. The real Allied forces were preparing to cross the river at one location. The Ghost Army set up a massive deception 40 miles south, creating the impression that an entire army was preparing to cross there instead. For 2 weeks, they ran a complete illusion: dummy equipment, radio traffic, reconnaissance patrols of real soldiers wearing appropriate insignia, even fake supply dumps. They coordinated with Allied air forces to conduct bombing runs on German positions opposite the fake crossing site, adding to the illusion of preparation. The Germans bought it completely. They shifted significant forces south to counter the expected crossing. When the real crossing happened 40 miles north, German resistance was lighter than anticipated because their reserves were in the wrong place. The Ghost Army's deception directly contributed to the success of one of the most important operations of the war. But here's the twist: the men of the Ghost Army couldn't tell anyone what they'd done. The entire operation was classified, top secret. When they came home after the war, they couldn't explain to their families or friends what they'd actually done during the war. The official records said they'd been in a headquarters unit, which sounded like a cushy job, far from combat. Some of the artists who'd been in the Ghost Army became famous in their post-war careers, but they couldn't talk about what many considered their most important work. Bill Blass designed clothes for Jackie Kennedy and became a household name, but he couldn't mention that he'd once designed a fake tank unit that fooled the German army. Ellsworth Kelly's paintings hang in major museums, but the deception operations he helped plan remained classified.